All right. Let's finish Daniel chapter 5. I think this is what, Mel, is this the seventh lesson? The seventh lesson in Daniel 5. We will finish Daniel 5, absolutely. But I doubt we'll get to Daniel 6. I will say this. The handout, which is done for the first half of the chapter, is 28 pages long. And my real thought about Daniel 6 is that it is hands down, let me say it this way. If you are a person who is looking for a chapter of Scripture that has application for the culture that we live in now, this chapter is as good for that as any chapter of the Bible. If you are looking for a chapter of the Bible that has application devotionally, this chapter, chapter 6, is as good as any chapter in the Bible. And if you are looking for a chapter that is as good as any chapter in the Bible academically, where you really want to learn the Bible, Daniel 6 is as good as any chapter of the Bible. And you'll see that in the handout that will start next week. You'll see that. But we're going to finish chapter 5. So we are on page 17 of the handout that you have. The handout for next chapter it's 28 pages for the first half of the chapter.
Nice.
You will learn. I told you, you'll learn the Bible. This in Daniel like no other book of the Bible. Daniel chapter 5 on page 17, verses 25 to 28. And this is the inscription that was written by the hand on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. 3 words. Mene, tekel, upharsin are 3 different weights or coins, so they are nouns. Mene, or mina, is the weight of either 500 or 600 grams. Okay, they're nouns. While the Palestinian mina is 500 grams, in this part of the world, they are 600 grams. The word mene actually comes from the verb meaning to number. This is going to be significant. Okay, in Hebrew and in Aramaic, the nouns come from the verbs. Like that's how the language is built. Nouns come from the verbs. So everything comes out of a verb, as it were. Okay. I'll just say this. Love is not something you have. It's something you do. Faith is not something you have. Faith is something you do. While Paul, for example, will use the word faith, John will, in the Gospel of John, will never use the word faith. He will always use the verb form instead of pistis, faith. He'll use pisteuo, which is to believe. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him. The Apostle John, basically, by the way he writes his gospel, says, I really could care less if you have faith. I want to know if you do it. Faith is something you do. Now, Paul cares if you have it, but John doesn't. John says, do you do it? And God lets, how many of you ever been cutting the lawn and you go out and you're thirsty, so you go over to the hose and you drink the water from the hose? Anybody here ever done that? Yep. The water tastes like the hose. The water that comes out of John says, I don't care if you have faith. Don't even bother me by telling me. Show me. That's John. So, mene, mina, is a noun, 500 or 600 grams, 600 in this part of the world, and it comes from the verb meaning a number. tekel, okay, is probably a shekel, which is 10 grams. A shekel comes from the verb meaning to weigh. And upharsin, okay, means and half shekels. Now, you go back and forth maybe between page 17 and 18 here. On page 17, you see how I color-coded the word. You can see, now remember this, the English is written from left to right, and the Hebrew or Aramaic is written from right to left, right? So in the Hebrew word for upharsin at the bottom of page 17, you'll notice that the first letter, the letter on the far right, is highlighted yellow, whereas the two letters on the left of the Hebrew or Aramaic word are highlighted green. So they are at the end of the word. So the yellow letter, the one-letter prefix, is the word that makes it say and, like A-N-D, and then the rest of the word. And then the green, the two-letter suffix, is the letters that make it plural, okay, rather than singular. So this is the plural form of a singular word. The singular word, perim, or Paris, I didn't say it right, Paris, which is the same word that appears in Daniel 5:28. So it looks like it's a different word. It's not. Okay, one is singular and the other's plural. Same word. Parson comes from the word to divide. Okay, why is the word mine repeated in Daniel 5:25? Diane, you asked this question. Okay, why is this word repeated? Well, the repetition may be the clue to the interpretation. In Daniel 5:25, mine's first appearance could be a verb. This is why I pointed out that the nouns come from the verbs. Okay, so mine could be seen as a verb, which then instead of being the weight would mean to count. Count the weight. You've been weighed in the balances. Count the weight. The second time, it may be the noun, so now it's a coin or the actual weight. Daniel may have recognized the repetition of this word as a clue, and so Daniel read this like counted. A mine, a shekel, and a couple of half shekels. So Daniel counts up the mine, the shekel, and the plural parsons. The plural parsons indicates two parsons, so a couple of half shekels. Notice, though the word Paris in Daniel 5:25 and Daniel 5:28 is the same, but there is this distinction. In verse 25, it's plural, and in verse 28, it's singular. The two half shekels are implied by the plurality of the word parson. The noun parson in verse 25 appears in verse 28 as paris, which is a verb. That verb means to divide in half, which implies two halves, especially since the noun is in the plural form in verse 25. I worked hard on saying, how do I say this? Because this is hard stuff. And in verse 28, the verb is in the singular form, which means that it should be divided in half only once, because it's singular. It's plural, so there's two, but it's singular, so we're only going to divide it once. So two halves. Make sense? Also of interest. This is hard. Maybe this is why Daniel's so wise. Okay. Also of interest. But when we get to Daniel 6, we're going to look at the whole thought of wisdom. How often he is referred to as the wisdom of Daniel, the brilliance of Daniel. How did he get it? That's what we're, and how do we get it? How can we get that kind of wisdom? It is promised to us. But just because it's promised doesn't mean you will get it if you don't do what he did. You will not get what he got. We'll see that next chapter. Also of interest then. The word parson could be pronounced differently, which would make it the word Persian. All you have to do to make it pronounced differently is change the vowel pointings, which did not exist for another 1,000 years. And that will change the way the word is pronounced. That's all you have to do. Okay, so the Persians were allied with the Medes. The Medes and the Persians conquered the Babylonians. Not the Persians, not the Medes. The Medes and the Persians. Okay, so the double kingdom implies that the plural halves, parson, refers to two halves rather than just one half. This two part is going to become significant in Daniel 7, Daniel 8, when we start looking at the kingdoms. This part of the interpretation then took wisdom on Daniel's part. And the interpretation of Mene, or Mina, could also be for emphasis, since the Medes and the Persians were preparing to invade the city right as Daniel is interpreting the writing. Because this chapter is going to end with them conquering and Belshazzar being killed in this chapter. Art Scroll will support this kind of thinking. It says that the first time the word parson appears in verse 25, where it is plural, it means to divide or break. And the second time the word in verse 28, where it's singular, it means Persia. So you can see there's two different ways of, and they're both kind of coming together in this. And Daniel sees these two different ways, and he brings them together. Okay, verses 29 to 31. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a gold chain around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, going over to page 19. 62 years old. Interestingly enough, one mina, which is 600 grams, is equal to 60 shekels. Since the first time the word mina appears, it's being seen as a verb now and not as a noun. We're only going to count one mina and not two minas, because the second time it appears, it is a noun, and the first time it's a verb. So the total is 600 shekels, not 1,200 shekels. Does that make sense? One tekel, or one shekel, is 10 grams, which is one shekel. A parson, or two halves, because we're only going to split it once because the word is singular, two halves, is going to make up a total of one shekel, which is 62 shekels. Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom at the age of 62. So Daniel predicts the age of the man who will conquer Babylon that very night. To make this even more awesome, there are historians who actually think that Darius the Mede is the same person. We'll look at this next time. That Darius the Mede is actually possibly the same person as Cyrus the Persian. And if Darius and Cyrus are the same person, then the man who will conquer Belshazzar is likely half Mede and half Persian, which would be symbolized by the parson, or two halves of a shekel. This is like amazing, isn't it? All right. This is out of the New Bible Dictionary. I always think it's kind of funny. Whenever I see something that's entitled with a book that's called New whatever, I'm reminded of a teacher that I had back in college, like 19 whatever, long time ago. And he joked about the fact that any book that has the word new in the title, when it's 100 years from now, it's still going to have the word new on it. But the New Bible Dictionary, which was published in 1965, when I was, 8 years old, says this. The view held by conservative scholar D.J. Wiseman has simplicity in its favor. It claims that Darius the Mede is another name for Cyrus the Persian. This is based upon a translation of Daniel 6:28, which the Aramaic, and I've added, but not the Hebrew Masoretic text, the Aramaic permits to read Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, even the reign of Cyrus the Persian, meaning the same person. The fact that monarchs had more than one name is common in ancient literature, and Wiseman's view offers another conservative explanation of this problem in Daniel. The problem is, who's Darius? And there's all kinds of problems for who he is, because basically there's no evidence that he ever lived outside of the Bible. So we'll look at that when we get to the next. But so what if there's no evidence outside the Bible? So what? We have the Bible. Okay, there was no evidence that Pilate ever existed until like 30 years ago. There was no evidence that Belshazzar ever existed until, like 50 or 100 years ago. That was in the handout before, and it'll come in the handout next week as well. So not only then did God predict the age of Babylon's conqueror, but he also predicted the double ethnicity, as God showed Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4:17. This decision is by decree of the watchers. That's the beings out of Genesis 6, as we looked at in Daniel 4. The watchers are mentioned, as you'll remember, 3 times in Daniel 4, and you can look at that in the handout if you have it. If not, ask Mel, she can help you get it. And the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will and sets over it the lowest of men. So from the very beginning of Babylon, her days were numbered. As Daniel 5:26 says, God has numbered the days of Belshazzar's reign and therefore of Babylon's rule. In God's time, he closes the curtain on Babylon. Daniel 5:29 on page 20. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a gold chain around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Belshazzar's gift of honor was short-lived. One night. Isn't it interesting that in its rise to power, Babylon had conquered and destroyed Israel, and now her last official act is to honor one of Israel's exiles, who, if you will remember, in Daniel chapter 1, is a member of the royal family from Israel. Man may have the first word, but God will have the last word. Or as the Daily Study Bible series says, the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly small. And as the Lord said, for everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. And to him whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more. I'm really looking forward to doing Daniel chapter 6 with you. It'll take as long as Daniel chapter 5 did.